So if there are shy ones among us, and it's time for our chat, feel free to write your comments and take part in the conversation by using the chat button, which is right down on the lower rung of your Zoom screen. And when we open up for conversation, I do invite you to raise your hand when you want to contribute and to speak. And you can raise your hand by using the reaction, just clicking on the reactions button. Okay? And also, you may not want anyone to see you. You may have had a hard day. That's fine. You are welcome to keep your video off. That's okay too. So let me just open us in prayer. And then Tanya and I will share some of our aha moments for a bit. Then we will open up the floor for all of us to share. Then Tanya and I will share some more moments. We'll all share again, and then Tanya will wrap us up. Okay, so that's how our evening is going to flow. A bit of Tanya and I, a bit of all of us back and forth. So let's pray. God, I just thank you for Austin Channing Brown's powerful words to us in this time, for such a moment as this. I thank you for this book club event. I thank you for all the women who have read this book or are reading it. I thank you for how you are moving among us. I thank you for your patience and your love and your tender kindness. We are all at different stages on this journey toward racial justice. We are at different spaces of understanding, of acknowledging, of owning our indifference, verbalizing our pain and our hurt. And you see all of that, and you hold all of that so close to you. So God, we invite you here. Your spirit is here. Season our conversation. Help us to listen well to each other. Help us to affirm what we hear. We pray all these things, Jesus, in your beautiful, wonderful name. Amen.
Amen.
And so Tanya, share with us some of your aha moments.
Well, you know what? It really, the first few pages of the book really struck me right away. And in that first chapter, you'll recall she talks about her name and discovering as a child why her parents gave her the name that she has. And, you know, I think if I had read this book before I got married, I might not have reacted in the same way. It might not have been as significant to me to hear that, but the fact that she says, you know, her parents chose her name specifically because it would really just open up the opportunity for interviews. I have to say that I have actually realized, I don't think I would have believed that that was the case if I hadn't married who I married and realized my husband is Chinese. And that really is a reality that people are excluded from things, even just based on their name. And for me, that was a huge, wow, it wasn't, because to be honest, I didn't believe my husband when he first told me that he sometimes doesn't even get an interview for things, even though he's qualified or that age. And he said, you know, I think it's my name. And so that was something that was really huge for me. And in that, I think for a number of years now too, kind of wrapped in with that whole concept of name, is the idea that our names are so important and knowing our names. And for me, my name is Tanya and it's pronounced Tanya, but if you see it spelled, it's Tanya. And I have often been called Tanya by people. And most of the time it doesn't bother me. I'll correct people, that kind of thing. You know, that's all right. Sometimes people who've known me from a long time, though, keep making that mistake and it gets irritating. But that's just a little thing. I think about people, though, who, for myself, who come from all over the world, and they come to Canada, and either their names are constantly mispronounced, or we feel, and when I say we, I feel like as a white person, as an English speaking person, we feel like they need a different name. And certainly, you know, I spent a lot of time in a Chinese church, and often those who have a Chinese name also have what they say is an English name, and they'll go by both names. And that's something that I've worked hard, and I learned this, I think it's really important that we call each other by our names properly, that we learn how to pronounce each other's names. And so this whole thing in this first few pages about her name was really a huge aha for me in just realizing the power of a name in so many different ways. And then also just the power of being able to learn and pronounce somebody's name the correct way, and what a difference that can make. And so that kind of started out for me in that. So that was kind of my first aha moment. And then, just moving on through it, as she started to talk about her experience growing up in predominantly white communities and schools and places. In chapter 3, when she talks about the teacher who admitted her seating plan, kind of aha moment, I guess, of realizing that as a teacher, as a white teacher, that she was creating seating plans based on putting kids of color in apart from each other because she was making assumptions. And this scene where she realizes it and then confesses to her students. And Austen goes on to talk about her reaction to that and the confusion she felt, and just the what that left her with, kind of thinking and looking at all of her teachers, and is she seen for who she is, or is she seen for the color of her skin? I love that chapter. That was a huge one too, just going on about then the different teachers she had, and her wanting to include that she had to advocate for herself going through schooling. And I think that was also another big thing for me, just realizing that I, growing up, never considered at all any of what she's had to consider and think about, and wonder what her view is, and then what to do with what teachers might say, or people in positions of authority. So those are some of the big things that kind of got me right from the start in this book.
Yes, Linda Ruth just shared that there's actually been research about the whole name issue, where identical resumes are sent out, but the only difference is the name.
The name, yeah.
To what you were saying about your husband's experience and the experience of friends.
Yeah,
And that this
and
happens. Sorry, Pat.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And the other thing with names too, so that happens in resumes, but it's the difference that can happen just to go along with that when you have a different name. So again, to use the example of my husband, when I got married, for me it was just natural. I will take his name. And I know, I mean, some people don't do that, but I just, I would do that. He actually said, "Are you really sure you want to take my name?" And I thought, well, of course I wouldn't. I thought he was trying to be considerate. I was older, so I'd already was established in a career. People knew me by my maiden name. But he went on to say, no, like, are you really sure you want my name? Because it will affect you. And it's interesting how, you shared about the identical resumes. I have been on the phone now and received phone calls with people who don't know me. And the way that I'm spoken to on the phone versus when I show up in person and they see my face, it changes. And so for me, I mean, I'm still in a place of privilege, so it gets straightened out, and then different things, and I'm, that kind of thing. But it's fascinating how powerful a name is. Thanks for sharing that study. Because it's,
For me, one highlight from the early chapters of the book was in chapter 4 about the whole bus experience, Sukofa. Really, I had to stop and read that chapter about 3 or 4 times. And I'll tell you what really stood out for me. First of all, was how Austen wrote the chapter itself. Like, in 2 small pages, 250 words, she juxtaposes what the Black student says. I am done being mad because white people are X, 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 and X. And she just calmly states it and sits down. And then you flip over the page, and the last student, or white student, says, I cannot do nothing anymore. I feel your pain. I don't know how to begin to process what I've experienced and your pain, but I do know that I don't want my children to grow up, or your children to experience in a country, in a culture where, you know, this racism is so present. And what I love about that, not only did that juxtaposition, I thought, wow, but that Austin herself, the words of that student, where she says, doing nothing is no longer an option for me, shifted something in Austin. So it wasn't just the words of a Black female student, but the words of a white female student as well. And it made me realize that I think at some point we all need to have a Sufoka type experience where, like Austin says, right, the distance between history and yourself, it just collapses. And I know for me that moment happened last year with George Floyd. And it wasn't just all the news coverage and the response of, you know, of the masses that I saw on TV, but it was actually the response of one of my colleagues, Laura Matthews, that really, like, it just conflated that reality. There was no longer any distance between me and what I saw happening in the States and my own history of being racialized, both as a privileged person of color in Trinidad, where I was born and I grew up, but also here. And so I was able to, it just struck me in that chapter that, yeah, we all need a Sufoka type experience. Because, you know, I don't know that we are comfortable coming close to people's pain and sitting with grief, even historical grief, right? So I think how do we do that? How do we come close to the pain of history and the grief of the present? Because in a way they're both, you know, they're on the same continuum. So that was a huge aha moment for me, that chapter.
Wow. Yeah, that is wow, there's so much. We're just in the first few chapters of this book. I wonder now if maybe we pause for a moment and we hear from those who have joined us. We're going to have a few questions that are going to come up on the screen, and it would be great to hear from anyone who would like to share. Just look at those first two questions. What was a highlight for you, or what has changed in you or in your views on racial justice now that you've read this book? You know, we'd love to hear what some of your initial aha moments or highlights were. So feel free to use the reaction button and raise your hand, or to type it into the chat, and we'd love to hear from you. I see a hand up.
Yeah. Hi.
Unmute. Yes.
It's Kathy. It's the hand says clap, but I'm not clap. I'm not clap. Although I've enjoyed both of your perspectives so far. I'll have to say that I struggled right away with the title of the first chapter, and only because I'm not finished the book. I thank you, Bernice, for getting it to me as fast as you could. And when because I ordered it really last minute, just a week or so ago, and she said you either have to be a fast reader or you're not, or whatever. And so I'm only on chapter 7, but the first chapter just floored me because I don't know anything about this, and so it just was like, I'm exhausting, like, really. I didn't, you know. And then I started to see myself in some of the things that she mentions, commenting on hair, like, although hair is important, right? Like for me, we used to laugh, I was a nurse, and we used to laugh a lot in our, you know, the group you work with, because we were all talking about our hairstyles changing our hair because, you know, we all wore the same uniform. So the hair was our identifying kind of feature. So, you know, hair is sort of the thing, but I never realized my ignorance about things like that. And what the one that got to me and that I've shared with a couple of people as an example of why I'm at this book club and why I'm interested, it's when she was a little girl in the Toys R Us and she picked up a toy and her dad said, no, not today, you can't have it. So she stuck her hands in her pocket to stop herself from touching anything else. And her dad identified it to her as the wrong thing to do because you become a suspect. And it just, that was upsetting to me.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. It is a tough book to read through. Thank you for sharing kind of those things.
Yeah, for me, I finished the book. I couldn't put it down. I just could not put it down. I was like, oh, so I literally read it in 2 days. And what a hard-hitting, honest book. First, she writes very well, and she grabs you to want to carry on and looking for the light at the end of the tunnel, because the first part was already so hard, and then it got harder when they traveled to the plantation to see the history. And I just listening about reading about lynching, you know, and the first day when I came to that part about lynching, and I went to sleep that night, and I laid in the bed, and I was thinking of how history was so painful during that time. It was so painful for those who were oppressed, and yet it never it never occurred to so many others in the rest of the country. And so I was like, second day, bawling my eyes out. So I think for me, the highlight, well, actually, to me, the low light was when she kept writing. Her professor said, no friends here, no friends here. And it was so sad, because it was saying that there was not, there still wasn't any friends that would support or see the perspective of what Austin was going through. And she came from a very unique position, in that she came from a church perspective, coming from a private school, and I believe Catholic too. I believe, and then her parents being divorced, and then her going to visit and live in eventually a neighborhood that was predominantly Black, and so she was discovering her background, and I wonder how many others haven't discovered their backgrounds, haven't discovered it. And for me, I really wanted to read a book, and this book, or I wanted to read a book written from, first of all, gender, women, a woman who's from a Black perspective, who came from a school that was predominantly white, and then she discovered herself in a Black neighborhood, and then attending a Black church, and she loved it there. She loved it at the Black church. I was just processing everything on the third day. I just sat down and just processed everything on the third day, because there was so much. And immediately when you were talking about the name, Tanya, you are just dead on, because my friend, she's Chinese, she's a lawyer, and when she had two girls, she made sure she chose gender neutral names for her girls, because as a lawyer, she knew how she was always picked last for fear of being too gentle, woman, feminine, and Asians are perceived as not aggressive enough to defend you. So,
Wow.
yes, right.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
And you raise a good point there, Bernice, because I think part of what makes this book such a rich read is that it is, in a sense, I believe what she's doing is lamenting, is sharing her awakening to the dignity of her Blackness and what it means to be Black in a white context in the United States. So, and that it is, she is discovering who she is, which was something that resonated with me, and I think makes the book, you stay with it, Kathy, to your point, even when it's off-putting, there is still a vulnerability about what she is saying and how she's writing it, that will keep you there, I believe. And to, Bernice, you also raise a good point in terms of how she was brought up, then in discovering the Black church, etc., back and forth. And a highlight for me, when she talks about, what I love about being a Black girl. And Tanya and I were talking about it when we were preparing for tonight. And I said, Tanya, I never have ever written down a list like that about myself. What I love about being brown, what I love about being mixed. I thought I wouldn't know where to start with that. What do I love about being brown in Toronto and mixed and an immigrant? So, very, very rich and so interesting. Yeah.
I have to say that coming from a biblical standpoint, God made us one race, one human race. We are all loved, regardless of what the color of our skin is. And many of my friends now have mixed race marriages, and all of my friends encourage the discovery of both worlds. The loving yourself in both worlds, regardless of what color you are. God made one race. and he loves us all.
There is that tension, isn't there, in terms of that as truth, and here and now living in the reality of how do we celebrate the differences even, and how do we talk about when, you know, a majority community in a Christian context seems indifferent,
Yes.
minimizes your experience, the experiences that you have based on the color of your skin, may make, you know, isn't prepared to change structure or advocate for systemic change.
Yes.
And I mean, as she and she calls that out in the book, right? And when she talks about reconciliation, but you know, we are quick to be nice. And I think part of that is understanding, Bernice, that value of we are one, right? That's what Paul preaches. We are one. And yet, what does that mean for equity then, and equality? Tanya, did you want to share some more highlights?
Sure. Yeah, I can share some more highlights. This, I'll be honest, you know, the next section that I want to share is definitely was part of the most challenging, I think, chapters for me. And you know, I want to highlight a few things, pull a few things out of chapters 5, 6, and 7, which is, you know, the whiteness at work, the white fragility, and all white guilt, and all of that kind of stuff. That those were some big highlights for me, but also some huge challenging pieces for me. And I think in chapter 5, the just the way she goes through her workday, and kind of, and I think I mean, this is her story. It's hard to hear, but this is her story and her experience. And part of me thought, like, that's real. That seems really exaggerated. And yet there's so much going on there that she, like, kind of outlines just the exhaustion of a workday of being a person of color, and all the little decisions she has to make, and all the things she has to be aware of, and how she speaks, and, you know, the things that happen where she is then called out and said, well, you know, if you just speak in a different tone, you know, meaning make it better for the white people, you know, make it easier for them. Don't make them feel so bad. And that really, that was huge, because I think about that too, just in terms of, you know, where have I been guilty of this? Where have I said, you know, like, I understand what you're saying, but if you just communicate it differently, then people will be able to listen to you. And that really was a huge thing for me too, to say that, wow, like, basically, exactly what she said, you know, her feelings don't matter. That's what's being communicated to her. That's exactly what happens when we do that. When we say, you've got to change for the sake of us white people to feel more comfortable. And these are like chapters of tension. And, you know, and you know, they're not, you know, people of color are not responsible to make me feel better about the way that I'm treating them, when it's not treating them with dignity, with respect, with understanding their differences, and appreciating those. You know, she talks about the subtle messages of whiteness that are just everywhere throughout her day. And even being in a Christian organization, even being, you know, in a place where they're kind of saying that they're about equity and inclusion and all of that, just to see that. And you know, even the prayers of well-meaning friends, she talks about how really their prayers, when you listen to the words, it's not so much acknowledging her pain as saying, like, you know, help Austin, help her to be more graceful in her, you know, receiving of that. And so those are big things for me that really have given me a lot to consider and to think about. the nice white people section too. That I want to pull that out, I think, because that is so close, I think, to me, and something that really shifted in my understanding of racism, because I realized that, you know, because I think that I'm nice, and I think that probably all, especially in churches and as Christians, we think that we're nice, we care about people. You know, I had a conversation earlier this week where I was talking about doing this book, and my friend said, "Is racism still even a thing in Canada? Like, I thought we were way past that. Like, isn't like I like everybody. Like, I don't see colors." And I kind of challenged her on that color blindness kind of thing. But that's the thing. Like, we think, oh, well, but we're nice. We don't do those violent things. We don't make those kind of rude comments. So we're nice. So we're not racist. And so these chapters really challenged me and gave me so much to think about in terms of, you know, what are those microaggressions though that I'm guilty of, that are things that we don't even consider. We aren't doing with an intentional, malicious kind of, you know, agenda in it. It's just total ignorance that is actually hurtful to others. So those were some of those things. And then the last thing I want to just pull out of that chunk is when she talks about the white guilt and white people feeling like they need to confess to her, not something she specifically has done, but as she's spoken at things, feel like, oh, I've been like myself, my eyes have been open to some things, and so I want to go and apologize, you know, and so do I go to the person of color who's just spoken and brought attention and say, I'm so sorry, I did such and such and such to this person. She talks about how that's like, she's not the priest for the white person. She's not there to receive confession, and just the way that is actually another way that kind of hurts her, that brings her into a situation she wasn't even a part of. But we feel, and my husband pointed this out to me, he's like, that's still, as a white person, you keeping control, because you're going to say your apology and expect that absolution, if we want to use those confession kind of terminology in that. So those were big ones for me to really just sit with and struggle with, but listen to and try to hear, like, what is really happening in this, and where is that coming out in me, and how do I hold that, because I can't then live as this guilty, like, you know, I'm so bad as a white person kind of feeling, but how do I own that and move forward and learn from that, and learn to listen better, ask better questions, and speak differently, be aware of just the structures in place and the things in place that kind of lend to that kind of an atmosphere. So that's kind of that whole package of like tough chapters around whiteness was really huge for me. Yeah.
Do we want to speak into that a bit, for anyone who's had a chance to, you know, dive into those chapters? How did that feel? What was your experience reading those chapters? Tanya, I'm going a little bit off script here, but that was
That's
a big that was a big chunk. So I'm just wondering how, you know, I'd be interested in hearing how you processed what she was writing.
So I put my hand up, I'll dive in. Tanya,
Yeah.
Thank you, Tanya, so much for picking out like some of the really, really good high points that are kind of challenging for us as white people to really confront and see, right? But I think this is such important, that it is so important for us as white people to be looking at these aspects of white culture and white supremacy, actually, because we tend to be completely oblivious to them because we think this is just the way it is, right? Because that's the way we've breathed that air from the time we were born. We've grown up in this culture, and we just think, what do you mean? This is just the way it is. And so really leaning into this and really seeing, wait a minute, this is actually not, not really the way that things should be, just because we think it should be that way. And I think one of the things you touched on, niceness. I think niceness is so huge, especially in
Yeah.
churches, right? Because we are so invested in, we actually kind of think Jesus was a nice white person. You know, we
Mm,
do. And
right.
honestly, Jesus was a passionate brown Middle Eastern man, and a whole lot of stuff he said wasn't what we would consider nice. He was pretty tough. He turned over tables in the temple. He called out the Pharisees with some pretty choice words. Like, but he's exemplifying something that goes beyond that surface whiteness that we tend to elevate in our culture and actually use to silence. We use it as a
Mm,
silencing device
oh,
to silence other
yeah.
voices, just like what she was saying and what you were talking about, right? Tone policing and, oh, well, and I mean, you just have to read Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail. That's what the white moderates were basic. And they were all clergy people. They were all
Right.
church leaders, right? And that's what they were saying to him. Oh, Martin, you're going a little too far and you need to moderate this and that. And here we are, like what, 50 years later, 60 years later, and we're still doing it. We're still playing out of that playbook. So I think
Yeah.
it's almost as white people, especially if we're not in a position where we maybe have a lot of proximity to people of color, where we can actually do like more active things, but kind of deconstructing all this whiteness stuff
Right.
is huge, especially in our churches.
Mm. Oh, yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah.
So I actually put it in the chat. I don't know if everybody's looking at the chat, but Austin's latest piece is called Dear Nice White People. And it's kind of, I don't know if you've all, I think Renee's read it. I'm not sure who else has, but I highly
Yeah, I
recommend it.
read that.
She's like a
Yeah.
brilliant writer, right? And it is
Yeah.
really good.
Yeah, it is very good. Thank you for putting that in the chat. If you haven't read it, it is definitely worth reading.
I'm struggling a little bit because I haven't read the whole book. I've just got to 7.
Mhm.
And I agree, there was it was a difficult read through those chapters that you talked about, Tanya. But I'm not understanding. I need to help. That's why I'm looking at this book club, because I'm totally ignorant. I don't understand what's wrong with being nice. Like, I don't understand that nice, why, like, we have, I have 2 Jamaican ladies in the church. I love them. Like, is that wrong? Like, I don't know. I don't understand what the problem is when we're
Mm.
friendly and nice.
Maybe I can speak to that a little bit. It's the way niceness
Sure.
kind of gets used.
No,
Almost
give me an example.
Sure. Okay, well, Tanya kind of mentioned the example that Austin had mentioned about her tone, right? And how she had to be so careful in her workplace. So that we have a certain way that we think we should speak to one another. But which is not so much wrong in itself, but it's the way that it's used if it means that we don't listen to people who don't fit our norms. Okay, so so one of my dearest friends at my church, she's Black. She was born in Haiti, but she came to Canada as a very small child. She grew up in Ottawa. She went to mostly white schools, white universities. She's a lawyer. Um, and and sometimes she can be kind of passionate about things, but white people don't want to listen to that if they think that she's not expressing it nicely. Like I'll just give an example. We had our week of fasting and prayer at our church, and she was really sensing something from the Lord. And she was really struggling with whether she should speak it out or not. And she was private chatting with me, and I was just saying, pray about it, ask him if he wants you to say it. And she did feel like it was something that she should say, but it kind of like was almost ripped out of her. She knew it was a hard word, right? And oh man, did the white people ever get their panties in a knot, right? With the way she delivered it, even though I think it was an absolutely true word from the Lord, right, speaking right into the heart of stuff that's going on in our church. But oh man, and I heard a whole lot of, oh, that was immature, and she shouldn't have said it. And so that's where white niceness is used to try to silence and not listen to things because it made people uncomfortable. We as white people really don't like to be uncomfortable. And one of the things I think we need to lean into and learn is to be in these conversations and be willing to be uncomfortable and keep listening. What she had to say was absolutely from the Lord. It is a really good word. It is a challenging word. It's not like a nice word. It's not like him. It's like, you know, in Revelation when Jesus is talking to all the churches and he says, okay, you got this part right, but this I hold against you. It was that kind of a word. This I hold against you, church. And man, the white people did not want to hear it. They got very uncomfortable. So does that help, Kathy, to understand how niceness and this value of niceness above all else, even above, you know, challenge? And like Jesus wasn't always nice. I love that about him. I love that about him. You know, I think
it does. Yeah, Linda, it does help. But I also I hate this. But I experienced some of like that myself, right? Like people, I'll say, and I'll get backlashed for something, you know, or misunderstood. Like to be honest, a lot of times reading the book, I could see myself in a lot of other areas where I, as growing up as a young girl who was always chubby, and so the chubby, you know, the fat girl, and that whole thing, and there's an element of that. In a way, I mean, I don't want to compare it at all to Black racism, because you know, it's not the same, but there was an element of it. Every time I read the book, every time I picked up stuff, I thought, oh, I can identify with that a little bit. Like I've had that kind of little hurt myself, and I've been misunderstood, and not everybody's been nice to me in the church. And so yeah, I'm just like, how is I think where I see the big thing, and I was going to say it earlier with when Bernice talked, you know, we didn't learn historically, we have not learned correct historical events, you know, we're discovering things, right? But you know, Hollywood puts out stuff, and I mean, just this last week on PBS, I watched this the long story, really good movie about the sugar plantations in Jamaica and how the British just, you know, the things that happened there, and how awful, but it was centered on one character, right? And so I think so then putting the book and then bringing it up to the current time, it made me understand, because I think as I aged and understand that history really does impact all of us in our personal life, in our whatever happens in our country, in our society, wherever we are. And so, you know, I could see this trailing through up right into her book, where that was coming from. But anyway, so yeah, two things. That's it, I guess.
And you know, you're right. People shouldn't have talked to you that way about chubbiness, or, I mean, that's right. You know, I mean, we are not very good at treating other people with respect and dignity, you know, in whatever shape, color, you know, class, whatever. You're right. And so it's just that what happens is that whiteness is used in a particular way to kind of protect white people's feelings, you know, at the expense of the feelings. That's kind of what Tanya was drawing from the book. So that's where it gets toxic, right? It's not to say that people should just have carte blanche to be crappy to each other. I mean, although you would think people would think they do if you're on social media for any length of time, especially people who identify as Christians. Oh my goodness. But you know, that isn't right. But it's just, again, it's where whiteness is kind of elevated in a certain way in order to protect white people's comfort and their feelings, rather than actually leaning in and listening to someone who has something important and true to say. You know, I mean, the prophets weren't super nice, you know, like you just read, you know, Jeremiah or Isaiah or even Amos, or, you know, when they were laying it out, the word of the Lord, it wasn't always put in nice terms, but it was true. and it needed to be said.
And I think too, to Linda Ruth's point, and Kathy, to your point as well, I mean, when what Austin, I believe, is revealing in her work that I think is so applicable for us here in Canada is that, you know, some will be unkind on the basis of your size or the basis of your gender or both, right? Some will be unkind on the basis of your skin color and where you're from. Some may be subject to prejudice because of the biases of people who are coming against them on all those three things. You're a woman, you're Black, and you're fat. Okay, so boy, do I have it in for you. You are capped. You are going to be capped. And so I think what Austin is saying is when that is used, it's not just about individuals who are nasty, unkind, and unchristian, but it's about so many individuals like that having the power to shape a culture, even within our churches, where that is normalized and that's the norm and it's okay, as opposed to, you know, this is simply not Jesus's way. And what would happen if we listened to the fat brown woman, even if she's passionate? I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've been told, "Oh, you're passionate, Renee," and that is true. But when you hear that cumulatively through the years, without much else, you begin to wonder, you know, is that all I am? A nice bunch of words strung together and presented in this way? Because I am more than that. So I think that what Austin is drawing an arc to how the majority in any community will set the tone, will define power dynamics, will define the politics in your church. And sometimes a lot of how that definition emerges is unseen. But perhaps those definitions could rest on things like, yeah, you're Jamaican and we don't understand your accent. So you actually can't be the chair of the deacons board. Someone else will. But, you know, we love when you clean up after lunch, after potluck. Do you see what I'm saying? There are, and that's race. There is nothing else to me about that situation but race, and I've seen it. So I think that if that helps, Kathy, that's what she's drawing out. It's not and so for me, another aha moment for me was in chapter 9, where she writes about anger and the freedom she now is having to express that anger in different ways. And I really resonated with her words on page 124. I was more afraid of my own rage than I realized. I had left my humanity at the door, and I thought about, not so much in the context of work per se, but I think just in, you know, when I look back at my whole life, I just think, I have micro-edited myself almost to the point of invisibility so I could fit in. So I could actually have a place at the leadership table. So I could be understood. So that, you know, my accent wouldn't be a distraction when I led worship or when I speak in front of an auditorium of people. And so you do this sort of super editing over and over and over again. And what happens? Like, you know, you're angry. At least I get angry because at some point I think, who is Renee? So when she talks about on page 126, she asks, so who am I then? Who am I? I thought, for me, that's the question of the season for me as I own my own voice and as I'm learning to trust it. And I loved in that chapter how she works through, you know, she's speaking, doing some activist work, you know, writing, speaking, writing some more. And I just thought, I could see that rhythm, that sort of unfolding and that freedom she feels to be able to express her truths, right? And what she is seeing and her lived experience. And calling us to a higher standard, calling us to Jesus, which is what she's doing in this book. And I thought, yeah, I am on that journey myself. I mean, I'm writing on the issue. I am, like involved with CBOQ's intercultural awareness group, trying to resource my church a little bit. I'm learning because, I don't have all the language down, and I don't, and I don't know what's normative in this arena. That my experience of being racialized is not a Black Canadian's experience, and or an Indigenous woman's experience, and so it's about, or an Asian Canadian's experience. So it's really about, I'm learning like everyone, but I really felt her book, Kathy, it just gave me permission to say, yes, I have felt angry. I have been sad. I have been disappointed over and over again. And yeah, I do get mad. And so how do I work that through? So that was a real highlight to me. Like, I love, Linda Ruth, you were talking about how Jesus was angry in the temple. And she talks about that on page 127, when Jesus goes into the temple and he, with his whip, and he just like clears the place. And she says, but I think those without power would have said that Jesus's anger that day led to freedom, the freedom of belonging, the freedom of healing, and the freedom of participating as full members in God's house. And, those are words for the church in Canada. A great documentary that we have a link to on our site is Seeking Salvation, the history of the Black church in Canada. And what really struck me as I read Austin's work was just, there is still in Halifax, in an Anglican church, the hooks where the curtains used to be, because those were where all the Black Canadians were put. They weren't sitting close up near to the speaker. They were asked to move back and then move up, and then, let's just put a curtain there. And I thought, wow, when Jesus died, the curtain in the temple was ripped from top to bottom. That should be, that is a whole new way that redefines access and equity and privilege for me. And so I think it's helpful when I think about anger to sort of think it through in my context in my life, but also in what I've observed in my jobs. And I've worked both outside the church and within the church for a long time. And then to think about the history in Canada and the history of the church in Canada, and what do we need to confess? What do we need to make reparation for? And so I love what she said there. And then, that moves right into chapter 13, right? Because she talks about, I'm free to write and speak. Who am I? And I love chapter 13, because in that chapter, I think she's saying, I want to be an agent of transformation. I want to be an agent of reconciliation, which is what that chapter is all about. And I love, again, what I find startling is she lists all the things that are not like reconciliation. And I thought, urban ministry, outreach work, in inner city schools or neighborhoods, doing short-term mission work. And I thought, I think there may be people who read this book and think, well, our church does this. Of course, we are well on the way to reconciliation. And she's like, no, that ain't it. We think that reconciliation, again, is all about us just contentedly being together. And it's about more than that. And I love that she anchors it in relationship. Like she says that, right? Relationship that is true and deep and just. And I thought to myself, who do I relate with like that in my church? black or white or brown or red. Who am I relating with at that level, and who wants to relate with me at that level? Because that's when that work of reconciliation begins. And so that whole chapter was a highlight for me, because again, I love how she goes right back to Jesus. Yeah. And she says, Jesus is not like the work of reconciliation is not about feelings. And she says, it's not about white feelings. It's about diverting power and attention to the oppressed and toward the powerless. And then she says, reconciliation is what Jesus does. Reconciliation is ministry that belongs to Jesus. All those pages in chapter 13, I thought that be a powerful message of the gospel right there. And so that gave me heart, even though I kind of got depressed again by the end of the book, because she's like, I'm living in the shadow of hope. I'm like, okay, Austin, what are you saying? But I love that she points to the work Jesus did on the cross, that work is on one level done. And so how do we live into that authentically? How can we be honest? How can we have these conversations and then do something, So for me, as someone who's facilitating this conversation in our ministry at Baptist Women, I think, she writes, well, conversation is not the end of the work, it's just the beginning. And I'm like, oh, okay, what are Abby and I going to do next? Like, we've got the rest of this year, and then we have it's not work that's going to end, right? And so what are we going to do? What are our next steps moving forward as a ministry? So, those were some highlights for me.
Yeah. Those are there's so much in there. I love what you've shared in that. And I think that this book is there's so much to talk about in this book. I'm seeing what time it is though, Renee. So I'm wondering if we want to bring this to a close. Unfortunately, this is such a good conversation. And you talked about just the conversation and that, but it's got to go beyond that. And I'm reminded of reading a blog I think I shared with you where it was, not just another book club. This book club is important. It's good to read through this book club, but I hope, and I think for me, what this really is moving me to is to read more books, but also that there is more that needs to happen, whether it's listening, whether it's more questions, whether it's for me really wrestling through the struggle of the things that I don't like that I'm hearing or that I'm reading. That's like, wait a second, I don't like, that's not me. And I'm married to a Chinese man. How can I be racist? Like, but she talks about that in the book too, about like that relational defense and, and that kind of thing. And so I'm wondering if maybe now we want to bring up the slide of the kind of the steps forward, I guess, beyond just the book club. I think we're going to have another book club. We're going to continue to have things, but we wanted to share also, as we bring this time of discussion to a close, some next steps that you might find helpful. And you'll see these up on the slide, and we've put these into like low, medium, and high, meaning low is kind of like it's the easier steps to take next, and that it increasingly requires a little bit more challenge or work on your part. And so what we've put for low is to explore the resources. Renee and Abby and the page that you've put together is remarkable. I don't know if everyone has had a chance to look at it, but if nothing else out of this time tonight, if you don't finish the book, or if you're listening to this and you haven't even read it yet, the very least, go check out that page and read some of the articles there, some of the different resources there. There's really good stuff there to continue this conversation, to continue thinking through just all of the issues around racial justice. And then, you know, if you want to do a little bit more, the Bible study in the September-October 2020 issue of Live magazine, that issue, if you haven't looked at that, again, so rich with all the articles in there. But that Bible study, I think, is so well done, and it really, do the Bible study. That's a great next step, and take some time to really work through that Bible study that's there. And then the what we've put into kind of the high category is to talk with a safe person. You know, we in one of those chapters in the chunk of white chapters, the chapters 5, 6, 7 that I shared a few things from. Austin shares about how when she speaks as a public speaker, or even in her church, how white people inevitably feel this need to come and confess their guilt. I mentioned that. But that is not the best thing to do. And she shared an experience in her church where she shared along with her white friend about an experience earlier in the book that she'd written about. And nobody had went up to her. None of the people in her church went up to her friend who was white and confessed their racial situations that they felt guilty of. They all went to Austin. And she talks about, you know, not being the confessor, the priest, and how that can be harmful. So I want to say that I am willing to listen if you, and to continue conversations with you, especially those of you who are white, who feel like, oh, maybe what I did is racist. Do I need to go talk to Renee about it? Or do I need to like go talk to another person of color? Come to me first. I'm happy to listen and to hear that. I'm not, you know, a priest. I'm not, you know, going to absolve you of white guilt, but I'm happy to be a safe person if you don't have someone else that you can talk with about the challenges you're having with this. But the other thing in the book is Austin she shares how she switched her response, and what she says now to white people, especially when they come and they're confessing their situations and all that. She says, what are you going to do differently now? And so Renee, if you are ready, you don't need to outline a situation where you feel like you've been an agent of racism, but if you are ready to say, what are you going to do differently now? Renee is the person to go to and to say and to maybe offer you that guidance. So talk to Renee, and perhaps there's some key ways that you can start doing something differently now. So these are just some next steps on that, because we're going to have there'll be more book clubs, I think, and more opportunities to talk, but we want to do more than just book clubs with this.
Yeah. I want to say that the questions that you saw on the slide and these next steps, they're all on our website. So if you go to the racial, the book club page, so go into resource. There's several ways to get to the same page on our website. So forgive me if I confuse for a minute. You can get to these slides, to these PDFs, going through Baptist Women Causes Racial Justice, or you can get to them by going to our resources landing page and then clicking on book club, and all of our whole schedule for 2021 will come up. And I have links to all of these PDFs. So the questions that we were exploring tonight, these some next steps. And then also, because again, you know, this is not an easy book to read for anybody. It's not an easy book to read, but such a helpful, brave, amazing book. We have some questions to guide you as you read that may be helpful. And, you know, we encourage you to just journal or write down, you know, what's the challenge, or I don't agree with this, or, oh my goodness, she's so rude, I need to stop reading. Or, man, this is like, she wrote what I wanted to say, and I didn't know I'd had this in my heart for the last 15 years, which was my experience. As I, you know, actually, as I read, I thought, yes. So I do encourage you to look at those links on our website. Tanya and I will be back to co-host another book club in June. And at that book club, as part of this whole Baptist Women series on conversations about race. And it's Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And so you'll find all the information on that book on our website as well, and the date for that book club meeting. Okay, I think that's it. What we want to do at Baptist Women is encourage us once a month to do something active. And in March, I do encourage you to check out CBOQ's Journey Together, which is their ongoing series, conversations about race in the church, race in the individual, race and youth and children's ministries, race and culture. And their next Journey Together conversation is on March 10th, I believe. And so I encourage you to register for that. I can send you a link. And so that's something we do encourage you to do for the month of March, is to check that, because it's talking about race in the individual. And I think that's always a good place to start. Yeah. Any questions? It's 8:08 and, you know, we want to wrap, you know, we're very conscious of time. Anybody want to say anything? We're good?
Thanks for doing it. You know, I've enjoyed this conversation and listening to you and learning. I'm a baby and I'm going to just keep going here.
Great. Well, I think Tanya, last words to you. Maybe you want to dismiss us with prayer. And we will only have missed like the first 12 minutes of CBOQ's conversation on race tonight. So we could probably parachute into that as well.
If you want to keep talking, that's right.
Yeah, if you want to keep talking.
That's right. Join me as I pray to close our discussion together. God, we are so grateful for this opportunity that we can listen to each other, that we can listen to the words that Austin Channing Brown has shared, that we can wrestle through our own thoughts and feelings and reactions as we hear her story. God, I thank you that we can be reminded both in her story and in this conversation tonight that that there are so many layers to this issue. There are so many different experiences, but God, most of all, that we can give dignity to one another by listening to one another's stories, by hearing and being willing to enter the difficult conversations, by recognizing that you are with us in the midst of the uncomfortableness, in the midst of the challenge and the struggle, that you are there, and that we can find you in the midst of it. And God, I do believe that we have seen you in the midst of this conversation tonight, as you have allowed questions to be shared and comments to be shared that reflect the challenge of this topic. So God, I pray that you would keep on stirring up within us the desire to learn and to grow, the desire to enter in to this challenge, and to recognize that truly you have accomplished the greatest the greatest thing in the cross, in bringing that reconciliation, but that we still have work to do with one another as we work that out. And so, God, we pray that we would continue to do this work, to care for one another, and most of all, that we would all have ears that are bigger than our mouths that want to spout our opinions and our reactions. God, may we continue to listen with those ears and to hear your voice in the midst of all that we have to offer in our experiences. And God, most of all, may our church communities begin to really take seriously the dignity of all people and recognize the value of all people in the ways that you have created them. in the beauty of who they are, their backgrounds, and all that they bring to our communities of faith. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, ladies.